A hardtail is a mountain bike that has a rigid frame with a suspension fork in the front. When many mountain bikers think of a hardtail, I'd be willing to bet that most think of their first real mountain bike. An inexpensive entry-level model with unreliable components, or maybe a super light short travel race machine. You see, as rear suspension was introduced and matured through its ugly, inefficient phase, the hardtail was relegated to the guys racing against each other in Lycra, or to beginners on a tight budget. When I look at how many hardtails were designed, even up until 10 years ago, I don't blame people for dismissing them. Back then it was hard to find something that could be used for anything but the smoothest of trails. But I'm here to tell you that that's not the case these days. Sure, some hardtails are still designed for crushing miles on buff single track, but there are plenty out there built to get rowdy. In this video, I'm going to explain how and why the lowly hardtail evolved from an XC race bike to the ultimate do-anything platform. Hardtails have been a part of mountain biking since the early days. While the first purpose-built mountain bikes actually didn't have any suspension at all, suspension forks weren't too far behind, and by the mid-90s, they were pretty much everywhere. Back then, hardtails dominated the mountain bike market, with full suspension bikes being mostly reserved as experimental designs for the pros. As suspension technology and frame design progressed though, full suspension bikes became a focal point for many bike manufacturers. With all of that R&D time and money going into full squish bikes, hardtails were put on the back burner. To be fair, the trails and obstacles being built and ridden on mountain bikes today are a lot more rowdy than they were back in the day, so full suspension does make more sense in many cases. Hardtails just didn't get the same treatment as full suspension designs. Their biggest innovation in 2 decades was a jump in wheel size from 26 inches to 29-inch wheels, and even that was a hotly debated change, mostly embraced by the racing scene. There's been a bit of a rise in hardtail popularity recently, and it's not a random thing. It's because at long last the humble hardtail has undergone a transformation to become a true do-it-all platform. With that brief overview of hardtail history in mind, let's take a look at a few reasons why the hardtails of today are far superior to their ancestors. If I had to blame the lack of interest in hardtails on one factor, geometry would take the cake. Geometry, or the angles and lengths of the frame of the bike, is the main factor in determining how a bike fits in rides. A bike built to be really fast uphill will have a lot different geometry than a bike built for downhill riding. In the past, most hardtails were designed with a bias toward cross-country racing. This meant they were built for speed, specifically on the uphills and flats. While climbing efficiency is definitely an important part of riding, the payoff of a fun downhill trail is what most people are after. In other words, XC-designed hardtails weren't great as an all-rounder for more aggressive trails. The last 5 years has seen a radical change in bike geometry across almost every discipline as bikes are being designed toward rougher trails. One telltale sign of that is head tube angle. While you can't really talk about geometry numbers in isolation, as they all come together to affect exactly how a bike rides, in general a slacker head tube angle is better in more aggressive riding and steep descents. In 2015, you'd probably find a head tube angle less than 66 degrees on a full-on downhill bike. Since then, though, everything's been getting slacker. A good example is the ever-popular Specialized Stump Jumper Evo. The 2015 model had a head tube angle of 68 degrees. The most current model? 64.5 degrees. Even cross-country bikes have seen some changes, and despite being built for climbing, they're also very capable on the descent. My 2021 Salsa Timberjack, a hardtail designed to be used for everything from bikepacking to rowdy trail riding, has also gone through this geometry modernization process. Compared to the previous generation, the reach has increased by 16 millimeters, the head tube angle slackened almost 2 full degrees, and the seat angle steepened by 1.6 degrees, with the overall wheelbase growing 10 millimeters. Instead of being designed to be fast in one direction or the other, hardtails are now being built to be decent in both directions. You can now even get something like the Kona Hanzo ESD, a hardtail purpose-built for rowdy downhill riding. In a recent video, I compared the 2 most popular plus tire platforms, 29 Plus and 27.5 Plus. These almost fat tires are another reason I think hardtails have grown in popularity. Many people complain that hardtails have too harsh of a ride and aren't all that comfortable for long days in the saddle. Plus tires and wider wheels allow tires to be ridden at lower pressures, which in turn absorbs trail chatter and even provides some cushion in rougher sections of trail. I'm not saying that it's as comfortable or smooth as a full suspension, because that's definitely not true, but it does make a significant difference in the ride feel and takes that edge off. I've done the Butte 50, a 50-mile mountain bike race with over 8,500 feet of climbing, twice in the last 3 years, both times on a hardtail. In 2019, I did it on a carbon fat bike with 4-inch tires, and this year I rode it on a Hardtail 29er with an extra 30 millimeters more suspension. While the course is relatively smooth, there are some sections that are essentially a couple miles of continuous rock garden. I was surprised to notice this year just how much of a toll those rocky sections were taking on my body when they were no big deal and actually pretty enjoyable on my fat bike 2 years earlier. A plus bike isn't quite the same as a fat bike, but I'll bet that if I had chosen to use my 27.5 plus wheel set on the same bike instead of the 29ers, I'd have been feeling much better in those sections. Another point regarding plus tires is in the traction department. In general, full suspension bikes tend to actually have better climbing ability on technical terrain because the rear suspension can keep the tire planted over rough surfaces. While hardtails do have the advantage in pedaling efficiency because they don't have the pedal bob of a full suspension, that efficiency doesn't matter if the tire is slipping or bouncing all over the place. Plus tires provide a lot more traction than skinnier tires on most trail surfaces, so sections that were difficult on a traditional hardtail are now easier to tackle thanks to the extra rubber on the ground. Although a hardtail is my preferred flavor of bike, I don't have as much industry experience or wisdom as others out there. So when I was writing this video, I thought it'd be good to reach out to someone who did. A couple of years ago, when I lived in Utah, I rode an American Fork Canyon with Steve from the Hardtail Party channel. Given his channel name, you can probably guess why he'd come to mind. But since then, he has ridden more hardtails than basically anyone else out there. I decided to reach out about this topic, and he was kind enough to jump on a call to discuss the current state of hardtail mountain bikes. I just kind of had this idea to do this video on, you've touched on it quite a bit, but like how hardtails have really changed and what makes them different nowadays. Because I think back to my first bike, and most people, their first bike was a hardtail, and it had terrible components. The fork was the absolute worst if it had a suspension fork. And so why do you think hardtails are traditionally seen as beginner bikes or the little brother to full suspensions? And is that deserved? Should they be considered that?
That's an excellent question. I think, why is it? It's for marketing. I also think it's historical. You know, in the 80s, mountain bikes began as fully rigids. Then we had some front suspension, and that's why the OG guys call it front fork. There's only one fork, but we call it the front fork because that's your front suspension. Yeah. And it took a while for full suspension to come around. And, you know, most companies aren't putting out media edits with their hardtails. And if they are, they're kind of shreddy. Nobody likes talking about the flow trails on a hardtail or not being like a pro rider. And so I think everybody wants to buy what they see in the videos and in the magazines and in the pictures, and that's pros shredding huge stuff and usually on full suspension. So I think that has a lot to do with it. Mm-hmm. There is this misconception that hardtails should be way cheaper than full suspensions, and that's part of that. It's why would I ever spend $4,000 on a hardtail? I would just get a full suspension at that price, and that just shows the marketing that people just soak up and just feel like, well, full suspension's always better. And full suspension's great. I'm not anti-full suspension by any means. I own a couple full suspensions. Yeah. But I am here to tell people that hardtails are really great. The problem is, like, hardtails aren't tons cheaper. Look at Walmart bikes. They're selling full suspension bikes for $300. And they do that because they know people want full suspensions. And somehow we're able to weed those out and realize that like a $300 Walmart full suspension is not the same as a $3,000 entry-level full suspension. And it sounds crazy to say that $3,000 is an entry-level full suspension, but that's what I consider pretty solid bike that'll keep you going for a few years these days. It's an expensive sport. Yeah, it is. But for some reason with the hardtails, we think like, you know, I need to spend under $1,000, and we think somehow a hardtail is going to get us out of Walmart category. And I haven't found a sub $1,000 hardtail that's worth upgrading. And I think one of the biggest plagues of hardtails is it doesn't cost more money to have your frame be boost versus non-boost, or to be a through axle versus a quick release. But for some reason, companies keep cranking out in the sub $1,500 price range quick release hardtails that aren't boost, that it doesn't at least the frame doesn't cost any more money to have just made it boost so it's upgradable, but they're kind of seen as a throwaway thing, and they are kind of a throwaway thing in that range because they're just, for some reason, especially at the big companies, companies are reluctant to just do a good budget hardtail, and that's frustrating.
Yeah, I think along that lines of with the axle, you're right. It is, some people view it totally as a throwaway, and it is because they end up putting things on it that don't have any longevity, and it's not going to be super, it's not going to be the fastest shifting or best braking, and then also it's probably going to have some issues pretty quickly. It's going to wear out quickly, and yeah, that's always been my biggest gripe with more lower end ones, is that I don't understand the axle situation. Like the Boost 141, I just thought, okay, is this a joke? What was the point of this? Didn't make any sense to me.
I agree 100%. I talked to the guys at Trek who developed that, and I said, why did you do that? Oh, it was just to hit certain cost points. And even right now, the Roscoe, the 22 Roscoe, they're all the same frame except for the budget one. I think it's the 6, and it's not even the same bike as the rest of the Roscoes. And the problem is the new rider's not going to know that. They're not looking in the specs, and if they see 141 QR, they have no clue what that means. So they just think, oh, there's a $3,000 Roscoe and there's a $1,200 Roscoe. I'm just going to buy the $1,200 one and I can upgrade. Except you can't. They're not even the same bike, and that's super frustrating. And I'm going to say it's bean counters trying to save an extra $5 on each bike by going with that 141 QR, and it just hurts the industry and new riders. It just burns them, and a lot of people have gotten frustrated saying, man, I bought one of those stupid 141 QR bikes. I didn't know what I was doing, and now I want to upgrade to a great wheel set, and my options are limited, and I'm still going to have that that quick release anyway. And so it will come back to bite them later, and people are going to be bugged at that company sooner or later. Why not just start them out on the right foot?
Yeah, makes total sense. Yeah, I went bike shopping with my father-in-law. It was his first mountain bike. We were living with him, and he just thought, hey, like, I guess if a couple of my son-in-laws are into this, I should get into it. And we went to a bike shop, and it was the guy at the counter couldn't even explain the difference between these two bikes. I think one was an Epic and one was something else. They're both hardtails. And finally I looked at it and I was like, well, that one's got boost in the rear and the other one's QR. He was like, oh yeah. And my father-in-law, he had no idea. He would have bought the one because it was cheaper, and the guy was telling him they were basically the same.
You bring up a great point. A lot of the sales guys have no clue, and they just regurgitate what's cool in the shop, and hardtails aren't cool. And I've been into so many shops about guys who were just rigid, sometimes young people, sometimes usually the old crusty guys have been around on hardtails, and they know that hardtails are decent if you get a good one. But
yeah,
I've just met so much resistance when I tell them I ride a hardtail, or this is the ride or the trail I'm going to ride on a hardtail, or when you say, do you have any hardtails, and they only have the junk, and they just perpetuate the, why would you ever buy a hardtail? And that needs to stop, because for a lot of people, a hardtail is actually the better option.
So on that topic, what do you think's been the most important change or innovation for hardtails in the last 5-10 years?
I actually don't think hardtails are very innovative yet. That's slowly changing with the small companies, but it's kind of the same things that have made mountain bike full suspensions better. I will say plus tires have been awesome, and the world still hates them. But if you talk to people who've ridden plus tires on hardtails, most of them see where that is an advantage. It's not always an advantage, but it's awesome having that. And so I will say plus tires, tubeless tires, just better rim and tire technology. But I think we've got a long way to go. Dropper posts are great and on any bike, but they don't, that's not really specific to hardtails. And I would say 90% of bike companies, whoever's over the hardtail model line, unless it's like the stuff going to the Olympics, like cross country XC race stuff.
Yeah.
They don't give it serious thought, and it's like a throwaway entry level product. And that kind of answers the first question as well, is the product designers and managers over these hardtails are seeing the sub $2,000 hardtails as a throwaway product or an entry level thing, and they don't even give it their serious time. So it's like having an accountant design a bike instead of a passionate rider that loves
Yeah.
hardtails. Even like when I chat with the guys at Pink Bike and they go off on why they hate hardtails, but then they say, well, I've only really ridden 3 hardtails in the last 10 years. And I just think, man, this is part of the problem, and it's never going to change unless we start treating them seriously.
No, I think that's a good point. I wouldn't say, I guess, to think about the question is more, I don't think hardtails have innovated anything. I think they have benefited from some innovation in the bike industry in general. Plus tires were one of the first things I thought of. Also, I think luckily as this modern geometry has come in, it has trickled into hardtails, and I think that's made them a more legitimate bike in some people's eyes. Of it can handle more, because if it was still just trickle down from the top level XC racers, most people wouldn't enjoy those bikes. They wouldn't be that capable.
I agree. Yeah, hardtails, it's like the good stuff always rolls downhill, and eventually it might make it to the hardtail in their lineup. And you're right, it's all trickle down stuff. Very few companies are approaching hardtails as a solution. It's rather, hey, this is the budget thing that we can throw a few things on. And most people shopping for hardtails, aren't looking at geo charts. They're not looking at standards and specs, and they won't know if it's press fit or not. But they're wrong, and that's changing big time. Hardtails are way more popular than ever. When I started the channel 3 years ago, everyone said, you're crazy. No one's going to watch hardtail stuff. Nobody likes hardtails. How are you ever going to grow that? And I said, watch. Like, I'm passionate enough about them that I think it might catch on. I can't take credit for the hardtail boom, but I am glad that is one of my goals of the channel, is to help people see them as legitimate and kind of have a hero saying it's okay to ride a hardtail, and it's even cool, and don't be ashamed of it.
Yeah, and you're kind of in the perfect spot for it too, because you're in Sedona. You're in a place that it's not like along the Wasatch Front in Utah, or all these places that have just the best XC trails that are smooth and flowy. You're in the chunk and double black, and so I think that's the perfect place to show what they're capable of.
Yeah, it's the worst place to ride a hardtail, but if we can ride them here and have fun, you can ride them anywhere and have fun.
Yeah, hey, that's the perfect place to show what something's capable of. So why do you think hardtails have become more popular? Like, what do you credit to that?
That's a good question. I think so. I credit Instagram.
Okay.
It's weird to credit social media for anything good, but that's my world. Honestly, this sounds super shallow, and I think it is super shallow. Hardtails look good, and you can build a sexy hardtail that photographs well. The lines just look so good. And I wonder, of those sexy hardtails we see, how many of them actually get ridden. And I do think, having a sexy hardtail, a lot of people are more proud of photographing their hardtail than riding it. And whatever floats your boat. I mean, that's how some, classic car restorers are. They just want to take it to car shows and film it and never drive it. Yeah. I'm the other way. I'd rather have something with a little bit of rust that drives great than a showroom piece. But I do think that's part of it. But you'll notice even on Pink Bike, whenever they have a news thing, if they can sneak a hardtail into like 10 new products, they'll put the word hardtail first, because they know it gets clicks, and people are interested in hardtails now. And hopefully people are just starting to see them as a little more legitimate. Geometry's come a long way, and budgets are a little bit tighter. So I really don't know. I just think it comes down to a lot of people not being afraid to step forward and say hardtails aren't dumb. They're kind of cool. Check them out.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think it really is just the lines. I think it's a classic look, and they just look good. Sometimes you get some full suspensions are honestly kind of ugly. You get this weird shock somewhere. And I think that's part of the reason, was it the new Scott Spark or whatever it is? Their full suspension with it's hidden. And yeah, it's to protect things, but it looks good. it looks really cool.
Aesthetics are way too important in this sport, but they sell bikes. I have so many people, oh, if that only didn't have this water bottle mount there, I'd buy it. It's too ugly. And I'm like, it's a bike. Just go ride it. Like when you're riding it, are you looking down thinking, oh no, there's an ugly water bottle mount there. I can't enjoy this ride because it's ugly. But I know that's important to a lot of people.
I mean, I used to be way more into the car world, into off-roading and stuff. And, you know, going back to Instagram, there's an account called Beat Not Babied. And that's what they're all about is, yeah, this car looks like crap and it's dented all the way down, but I'm using it. And I think that's the attitude more people need to have. I'll say I have not purchased a bike because of water bottle mounts, but it was a lack of them. And I want to have two.
That's different. I totally agree with that,
Wanna
especially
have
on a
two.
hardtail. Yeah, I think another reason hardtails are picking up is because there are some with good geometry. I still think we have a very long way to go, especially with mainstream stuff.
Yeah.
I think like Marin San Quentin was one of the first bold moves toward an aggressive hardtail with good geometry. And as more people start to ride a good hardtail, they totally get it. But the main problem is most people have never ridden a good hardtail. They've ridden that $1,200 one they bought at the bike shop on clearance that's an XC model with the quick release axles. 6 months in, they're trying to hit jumps and just realizing it's the wrong bike. And then they label all hardtails as bad and jump onto a nice all mountain full suspension. But now we're starting to see more mainstream hardtails with good geometry for trail riding with the plus tires. We've got Rocky Mountain Growlers. The new Trek Roscoes are good. The Specialized Fuse, even the old Fuse was a pretty good step in the right direction. And as more people borrow their buddies' bikes or go to a demo event and try one, the more they're like, wow, that was way more fun than I thought. And so availability of the good solid ones, really, if people would ride the bikes that I get to ride, they'd be sold on hardtails too. They're awesome. They're really fun, but most people don't have access to a great hardtail. So I don't know why we're able to do that with full suspension. Like we ride a Walmart bike and we can say, well, don't take full suspension seriously based off your Walmart experience. But we do that with hardtails for some reason. If you could ride a good $2,000 hardtail, your opinions would change. It still might not be the perfect bike for everyone, but you'd see what we're talking about how good they could be.
Yeah. And I kind of wonder, actually, I wonder if people, what they do is they end up buying a cheap hardtail to see if they're into mountain biking. They ride that and then they have the experience like you're talking about. And then they're like, okay, well, now I know I'm willing to spend some cash. And then they just skip all the way to a full suspension. They think, well, this is the next thing. And they're already buying something that's at a higher price point anyway, where if they bought something that was a hardtail at a higher price point, they'd find, hey, this is actually pretty great. And my experience before was purely based on the fact that this was an entry-level outdated bike.
Yeah, it's interesting. I agree. And a lot of people know, like the reason we're selling so many full suspension bikes at Walmart is because people have picked up that two shocks are better than one somehow. And so we also see a lot of people go, you know, I've only got $1,200. I'll buy the cheapest full suspension I can get. And that's even worse. But but somehow they don't blame all full suspensions as being bad. They realize, oh, I was too much of a cheapskate and didn't invest in a good bike. But for some reason, when that's a hardtail, it's easier to slap it on as, oh, you hate it because it's a hardtail. You should have got a full suspension. It's really interesting.
So this kind of goes along with your recent announcement about, you know, you've been designing this bike with binary. And by the way, it looks amazing. And I think we have some similar thoughts on features, especially 29 plus. But what do you think is next for hardtails? What's this next generation going to look like?
I don't know. I think we're going to see small boutique builders that build like 20 frames a year exploding. And that's going to be a focus of my channel coming up, is telling their story. We're going to see them exploding because they're more passionate about hardtails than anyone at a big Trek or Specialized or Giant company. And they're willing to push it and test things. They're also flexible and quick. So like if they want to try a new brake standard or try a new new tire size or wheel size or angle or geometry, they can build it in a month. And so I think we're gonna see more of that, and hopefully we see increase in the psychology and mindset around hardtails, that people are more open to them. Bike packing is doing a good job pushing them, but bike packing is still really small. It's a
Yeah.
niche thing, and more people love the idea of bike packing than actually going on the ride. I
Yeah.
get a lot of guys I consult with saying, "Oh, I need a bike for bike packing," and 2 years later, they still haven't actually been on an overnighter. And
Yeah.
so, and there are barriers there, and I get that, but I do think that's doing a great thing to push hardtails in the right direction.
Hmm.
But I I know where I'd like to see it, but I don't think it's actually going to go there. But we'll see. Yeah,
Where do you want to see it?
I want to see, instead of, and this is an assumption, I could be way off.
Yeah.
Instead of giving the intern to be the product manager of the hardtail line,
Yeah.
give your most experienced guy to, like, I think it takes a true genius to make a $1,200 hardtail that's amazing. And most
Mhm.
companies aren't putting those people on the product design. They're putting I feel like, I could be totally wrong, but I feel like the guys, everybody wants to be designing the full suspensions, and you have to work your way up the ladder. And so if you're at the bottom, you get stuck with the hardtail design. And, I just want to see, I want to see more people take them seriously, especially from a geometry standpoint.
Hmm.
And I think in the next 5 years, we're going to start seeing people using their brains to design flex into hardtails. We've
Yeah.
done a lot on the full suspension side with like the flex stays on a lot of those XC bikes now. Instead of a 4 pivot or 4 bar linkage, it's now a single pivot, but with flex stays, and they're able to, tune how that carbon flexes.
Yeah.
Hardtails should definitely be looking at that, but nobody's taking them seriously enough to look at that. And that takes money and engineering and investment. And so it's going to take everyone changing the mindset that hardtails aren't just for budget people. And I don't know if that's going to happen, but I'd like to see it happen. And I'd like to see Geo change still.
Yeah. No, I agree on that. I think that I was actually pretty surprised with the 2022 models that were coming out, the announcements. I was surprised to see how many of them, the hardtails, seem to go more modern than I was expecting. I expected it to be another incremental change, but it was a little bit bigger than I expected. But I
Like
agree
the
with you.
Timberjack,
Yeah, the Timberjack, exactly.
they
Yeah,
jumped like 3 models. They caught up big time with their Geo. In fact, the Timberjack's too aggressive for a lot of people, I'd even say, but that's just me.
that was. I mean, I definitely felt a difference when I first rode one. The new one, it was very. I almost didn't like it at first. It took me a couple rides to really get used to it and to appreciate the geometry, and
Yeah,
then also to realize, okay, there's certain places where um, it really, I can tell it's better suited for him. It's
totally.
got to be a little steeper when I'm just puttering around on some more tame trails. It's not quite as fun. It's still a fun bike, but it really comes alive once things get a little steeper, a little more rowdy. So that was one thing though I had thought of was that compliance built into the frame, and I wonder if I think it will. I think that is probably a big thing that's going to happen. Is that's going to start to happen, and you talk about that all the time about your Banshee, about how compliant it feels, and I wonder if there will be some trickle, and it's not down from full suspension, but it's actually across from gravel. I think that like Salsa does have their Class 5 VRS, which is like a vibration reduction. But I wonder how they could adapt that into there, because I think that's actually where a lot of this technology's come from. Is gravel's exploded, and
Yeah,
people you almost have, it's not quite the same, but you have almost the same problem of
that's a great point. Yeah.
if you're going over rough roads, you don't want to be just like hammered. And so yeah, I think there's going to be some crossover from that, hopefully.
And Trek did some of that. They've got that rubber coupling between the seat tube and the
Mhm.
top tube, that little
Yeah, the
vibration. But they're trying to reduce vibration to the seat, and what I want to see is reducing vibration to the feet.
oh yeah.
That's really where I feel the stiffness. It's not sitting down and pedaling and going over washboards.
Hmm.
It's when you're slamming into repeated rocks, or you're in Moab and you're going down these stair steps.
Yeah.
when you ride a stiff bike, it just bounces you off. And it's funny how many people want to argue with me. There's no difference in stiffness between hardtails, or you can't really feel that. Or this one YouTuber made a YouTube video on road bikes and he was measuring at the seat post and he couldn't find any noticeable, deflection. So therefore there's no such thing as a compliant ride. And let me tell you, they are dead wrong. Some of these bikes ride night and day different from others.
No, totally agree. And it's more than just frame material. You can ride two aluminum bikes or two carbon bikes or two steel bikes. And depending on how it was built, how it was designed, it feels completely different.
Totally.
As you can tell, Steve really knows his stuff. He touched on several of the points I mentioned earlier, but has a lot more experience with the nitty-gritty of the industry that I hadn't really considered. If you haven't seen any of his videos, be sure to go check his channel out. There's a link down below in the description. The humble hardtail has come a long way since someone first slapped a suspension fork on a bike. We now have hardtails built for everything from cross-country races to week-long trips to weekends at the bike park. I, for one, am glad they've seen a resurgence in the mountain bike world because I think they give a really fun and more raw riding experience that can sometimes be lost on a full suspension. So what do you think about hardtails? Do you love the modern hardtail, or do you think they should be left in the dust? Let me know down in the comments. If you enjoyed this, be sure to subscribe so you can see more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.